Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar of this new series of digital materialities. You are welcome to keep your cameras open, but please make sure that your mics stand off so that there's no background noise. And Valerie will be presenting. Obviously, after her presentation, you're very welcome to unmute yourself and ask your questions with or without your camera on. Geraldine, did you want to say a few words of?
Oh, I would like, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you, Ariane. And thank you, Valerie, for being with us today. We're very honored to have you in this new webinar, and thank you everybody for joining from all over the world, apparently, for this second webinar. And we'll be happy, of course, to have a debate conversation after the talk. Enjoy the talk.
So it is my great pleasure to welcome Valerie as our presenter this evening. Valerie Dulac is senior lecturer in Elizabethan studies at the Sorbonne University, and she currently holds a fellowship with LARCA, which is the research lab in which this webinar is based at the Université de Paris. She also jointly this year holds another fellowship from the Maison Française d'Oxford, and also one from or obtained with the museum in Stockholm, where she carries out research on miniatures. Her research interests include the circulation of artistic terminology in early modern Europe, animal-made objects used by limners, the portraiture of all living things in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and the rendering of luster, that elusive category, in watercolor. She's finishing at the moment a monograph on limning in English early modern drama, as well as translating in conjunction with another specialist of artifact of miniature called Céline Cachot, Nicholas Hilliard's Art of Limning into French. So without further ado, Valerie, the floor is yours. You can start sharing your screen and we'll be listening to your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much to everyone who've turned up, and thank you very much to you, Ariane and Geraldine, of course, for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. So I'm going to be sharing my screen up.
Tra l'altro vorrei ricordare che ho dedicato queste lezioni alle donne, ecco perché le donne sicuramente.
Can everyone see the screen? Is
yes.
That okay? Up. So there.
Does somebody seem to have left their microphone on? Somebody either listening to Italian or
speaking Italian.
Or speaking Italian.
I can't hear it anymore though, so. Okay, well, I'll start anyway, and we'll see whether there's any problem. So today I'm going to be speaking about the use of vellum in English portrait miniatures, and more specifically in portrait miniatures of the Elizabethan and early Jacobean periods, which are usually regarded as the golden age of portrait miniatures, and whose study generally centers around the figures of Nicholas Hilliard and Isaac Oliver, the most famous representatives of this pictorial genre, and who were the focus of the most recent international exhibition devoted to Elizabethan portrait miniatures. So recent research projects and publications dedicated to the art of portrait miniature painting in early modern England have vastly expanded our knowledge of the limner's materials and techniques. I'm thinking here, for example, of the incredible amount of work and cutting-edge technical analysis that have been undertaken by the people at the V&A in London, including Jim Murrell, Alan Derbyshire, Catherine Coombs, at the British Museum around Kim Sloan, and at the National Portrait Gallery, of course, This is perhaps best exemplified by the catalogue that was published for the 2019 exhibition, which I've just mentioned. Then even more recently, the Fitzwilliam Museum and the Hamilton Kerr Institute in Cambridge have started working on a technically focused research project entitled Secrets of a Silent Miniaturist Technical Analysis of Isaac Oliver's Miniatures. So most, if not all, of these recent projects have placed, I quote, renewed emphasis on the materiality of miniatures. And this is a quotation from Catherine MacLeod and Alexander Marr in the introduction to the issue number 17 of British Art Studies, which was devoted to early modern Elizabethan miniatures. Yet, in these recent studies, only relatively little attention has been paid to the choice of a surface, and namely vellum, for the period under study, and its interactions with the subjects of these small pictures. So my paper today examines the use of vellum as a painting surface for English portrait miniatures from the late 16th century and beginning of the 17th century, before it was superseded by ivory. Because of time constraints, of course, I won't have time to deal with some of the treatises that I'm looking into as part of my current research, but so I'll be using Nicholas Hilliard's Artem Limning as a focus, and other brief quotations from other works, but Hilliard will be the focus of my paper, because he's perhaps obviously the best known and the most relevant also to my contention for today. So my argument is that the careful choice and preparation of vellum, as well as its detailed description in the treatise by Hilliard, testify to the limner's endeavor to subdue the animal origin of the chosen material, the better perhaps to enhance his art as a kind of gentle painting. This is a quotation, a kind of gentle painting is a quotation from Hilliard. I'd like to show that Hilliard's words are worth analyzing alongside other materials, as they contribute to shaping the conception and the reception of portrait miniatures, as well as our own understanding of the historicity of visual perceptions. So early modern portraits in small volume were not yet called miniatures, and they belonged to the wider category of limming, which incorporated many other visual productions, not all of them on vellum. So I'm quoting from Talion. This is the next slide. Limming could be used for illustrations in travel journals, for military purposes like mapping, heraldic images, and decorative borders in documents, for painting counterfeits from life, for studies of flora and fauna, or for illustrating histories. Generally, they were not made to be framed or to be hung on a wall, but as illustrations for albums and portfolios. Well-known exceptions are exquisitely painted small portraits. The latter represent the highest quality limmings, as the most precious materials were used for the making. Now, vellum, of course, is among those precious materials, and therefore contributed in no small part to differentiating portrait miniatures from other types of limming. And this is the next quote that I'm going to be using. So miniature painting was not, as popularly thought, simply the art of painting on a very small scale, but specifically the art of painting in watercolor and its opaque form body color on vellum. So the use of precious materials and the use of vellum was integral to the portrait miniaturists' promotion of their art as gentlemanly. Nicholas Hilliard's Art of Limning lays the strongest and most explicit claim to the exceptionality of portrait miniatures among other forms of limming. I wish it were so that none should meddle with limming, but gentlemen alone, for that it is a kind of gentle painting of less subjection than any other work, for one may leave when he will, his colours nor his work taketh any harm by it. Moreover, it is secret, a man may use it and scarcely be perceived of his own folk. It is sweet and cleanly to use, and it is a thing apart from all other painting or drawing. Although deriving from the art of illumination, which the very use of the word limming serves to recall, portrait miniatures thus differ in many ways from earlier forms of limming. Now, the most obvious difference between miniature painting and manuscript illumination lies in the detachability and portability of miniatures, which were to be seen and enjoyed as independent works of art, rather than attached to the manuscripts where they first appeared. One other key difference resides in the very subjects chosen by illuminators, limners at large, and miniature painters. In both England and in France, the only other European country with a significant tradition of peinture en petit volume at the time, most miniature painters specialize in portrait painting, human portraiture, that is. This tradition, again, emerged on the pages of patents, books, manuscripts, before the small portraits were made into separable objects to be circulated around. My argument is that the development of this new format, concomitant as it was with the limner's claim for gentility, was closely connected with material and practical concerns regarding miniature production, including the increasingly careful selection and preparation of vellum in a way that tends to silence its animal origin. Although vellum was still favored for its unrivaled silkiness and whiteness, the effacement of the animal in this animal-made object is an essential feature of both Hilliard's portrait miniatures, and his treatise, his pen and pencils, working to the chief end of making sure that the viewer would only ever see a human face in a portrait and overlook, quite literally, the very support that it was limned on. This may be read as Nicholas Hilliard's explicit departure from other types of limning, both medieval and contemporary, as well as his active defense of the exceptionality of the genre which he specialized in, and that would only later acquire a name of its own. I'm here using the word defense as a deliberate allusion to the then popular genre of the apology. Although Hilliard's treatise does not qualify exclusively as a defense, of course, it was not intended as one. He self-consciously locates himself, I'm quoting from Elizabeth Goldrin's recent biography of Hilliard. So he self-consciously locates himself within an intellectual tradition stretching back to Alberti, Diadura, and Lemazzo, among others. The only precedents in English for a formal defense of the visual arts were Schutz's First and Chief Grounds of the Architecture for Painting and Building, and Dee's mathematical preface to Billingsley's Euclid. I therefore suggest to take the wording and rhetorical devices used in the art of limning most seriously, looking into the lexicon used for the description of vellum and other animal-made objects used to create his portrait miniatures. One may notice that Hilliard's pen replicate his pencil's work in covering up any form of animal agency in the making of his pictures. Now, to viewers, the very origin, the animal origin of the vellum is more often than not lost under its functionality and practical purpose. I quote, "The first animal object in the Dictionary of Traded Goods and Commodities, 1550-1820 by Nancy Cox and Karen Dunnell, sits between the opening entry, ABC, a child's spelling book, and the third, absinthe, the plant wormswood. It is abortive vellum, that is, vellum made from the skins of aborted cows or other animals. It provided a soft skin with a fine grain suitable for artwork. This in many ways might exemplify many animal commodities. In it, the actual animal's presence seems to have disappeared, to have been overlaid by human culture." Now, in the case of portrait miniatures, the actual animal's presence seems to have been overlaid, indeed very literally, by the representation of a human face. Fudge adds in a footnote to this passage that this making invisible of the animal in the vellum was challenged, if only briefly, in an exhibition held at the British Museum in 2010, entitled Fra Angelico to Leonardo, Italian Renaissance Drawings. Now, in this exhibition, a piece of sheep vellum was displayed next to a piece of paper, and viewers, this was pre-COVID, were invited to touch those pieces to actually feel the difference between the two, to realize how different they felt to the touch. Now, miniature portraits, contrary to vellum manuscripts and some drawings, although they were meant to be viewed in hand, this is a quotation from Hilliard, were not always supposed to be touched, and they were vulnerable pieces, and more often than not, they were encased in a protective and ornamental locket, some of them surpassing in value the limming inside, actually. Yet Hilliard insists quite forcefully in his treatise on the haptic appreciation of his prime material. Know also that parchment is the only good and best thing to limn on, but it must be virgin parchment, such as never bore hair, but young things found in a dam's belly. Some call it vellum, some abortive, derived from the word abortive for untimely birth. It must be most finely dressed, as smooth as any satin, and pasted with starch well strained on pasteboard well burnished, that it may be pure, without speck or stains, very smooth and white. The limner's emphasis on the impeccable and pure condition of the vellum tellingly alternates between the visible aspect of the surface, white without specks, without stains, and its tactile qualities, smooth is repeated twice. Now, this, of course, has to do with the way in which the support would react to the paint and the artist's pencils. The reason why vellum should be favored rather than any other material is first and foremost related to practical reasons. Vellum was the most practically appropriate surface for the curious art of limming. Yet I'd like to draw your attention to two things. First, the need to name vellum so that the difference from more to make the difference clearer from other more common sorts of parchment. The choice of a Latinate word, obscure enough for the limner to have to explain its origin and meaning, may be read as a form of semantic added prestige and value. This is all the more interesting as the vellum used was in fact more often than not the skin of young calves or lambs rather than that of stillborn animals. In his landmark study of the materials and techniques of medieval painting, Daniel Thompson has argued, I quote, that vellum means calfskin and nothing else, while parchment is a general term applicable to any kind of skin, including vellum. But such is the force of refinement that the smaller and thinner a skin is, and the less the likelihood that it should be calfskin, the more likely we are to call it vellum out of politeness. The Latin word abortivum, occasionally applied to fine parchment in the Middle Ages, though rarely, has given rise to another form of superstition which has become widespread, namely that the finest medieval parchment was made from the skin of stillborn calves. This was confirmed as superstition indeed by recent technical studies of 13th century manuscripts in particular, which have shown that what was called vellum was in fact not vellum in this restrictive sense. And it seems that this politeness, which Thompson mentioned in the quotation which you've just given, is also at least what still partly motivates Hilliard in giving such a detailed lexical analysis of the word for vellum. It seems that this description comes to add to the rarity and exceptionality of the materials that he uses. Now, the chief quality that was required and wanted of vellum, whether real or not, for portrait miniaturists, for limners, those chief qualities were smoothness and fineness. Morel and Muller, in their edition of a later treatise on limming by Edward Norgate, write that, I think I've got the quotation here. When they are removed from their card supports, the parchments of early portrait miniatures are tissue thin, translucent, and exceedingly finely grained. The outside of the skin is not the epidermis, which is removed in manufacture, but the papillary layer, which is much smoother than the granular reticular layer, which lies beneath it. So you've got here in this description all the qualities which were expected from vellum. Its smoothness, it's the fact that it was less granular than other surfaces. So this is why the words pure, smooth, and white are perhaps the most frequent across treatises on limbing in the period to describe vellum. The translucent and tissue-thin quality of vellum sometimes leads to slightly more eloquent similes in the technical literature, even though not all of them are similar. So you've got well, really different descriptions of vellum. Smooth, white are the most frequent words again, but you've got sometimes really straightforward descriptions, such as this one found in Peacham in the 1612 version of his text, where he described the vellum as being smooth and well, smooth again is repeated several times in this in the quotation here, but sometimes, and this is what I'm going to be looking at now, sometimes the description of vellum gives rise to more eloquent and telling metaphors. To give you just one example before going back to Hilliard, I'd like to show you this passage from Théodore de Mayerne, who, and this is a manuscript in which, I mean, he does not deal with limbing only in this text, but it's interesting because we know that Mayerne had met with Norgate and Hoskins and wrote about many aspects of limbing, among which the vellum and the qualities that were wanted from vellum. Now, in his description of vellum, he writes, I quote, "Ayez du vélin fait de la peau d'un abortif." So again, this superstition that it should be from an abortive, that it should be abortive vellum, ou mort dans le ventre de la mère, de sorte que votre membrane soit aussi diaphane que du verre cristallin de Venise. So here, the comparison, the simile with the comparison with crystal is rather interesting, because it's different from the simile that Hilliard uses, which is textile, as smooth as any satin. The reason I think this is interesting and telling is because cloth and fabrics are recurring concerns and metaphors in Hilliard's treatise. He very often characterizes colors using the same textile-based terminology. We've got velvet black, satin white, linen white again. So vellum in Hilliard's text is not only textualized, but also turned, as it were, into textile, thereby pushing the animal reference even further away. It's also rather telling that he should opt for mostly silk-based or silk-derived textiles, silk, satin, velvet, as silkworms at the time in England remained virtually unknown. So again, it confirms this sort of desire of pushing the animal reference away and of turning it into a textile that would not be associated immediately, at least, with animal presence. This probably ties in with Elizabeth and later on with James's own textile cum political agenda, as silk was becoming increasingly fashionable and was soon to replace fur, or at least to compete with fur in the monarch's gestures of sartorial and pictorial self-fashioning. Hilliard is here perhaps laying stress on the lustrous, lighter and more hygienic material that was favored by the Queen over fur, in line with his own self-discipline and obsession with the absence of hair, purity, cleanliness, part of his own agenda, in a word, aiming at defending his art as secret, gentle and clean. He, for instance, recommends all limners desirous to follow, I quote, his chief precept of cleanliness to wear silk, again, such as sheddeth least dust or hairs. The silk worn by the artist, very much like the vellum he limns on, should bear or shed no hair. Now, again, there's a very practical reason behind this piece of advice. Hair could have indeed damaged the limner's work. The semantic materials, though, in the treatise, seem to all contribute to elevate limbing and turn vellum into something other than just the skin of a dead animal. Besides its smoothness, vellum is also characterized by its whiteness in most treatises of the period. This, I believe, did have an impact upon the representation of the skin in the picture. The vellum should be as near invisible as possible so that the limner could apply his own flesh color over the vellum at what was then known as carnation, at least for the English miniaturists. Carnation here refers to the ground of flesh color that was applied very early on the vellum and card support. Hilliard and his contemporaries, from what Edward Norgate later described in his own treatise, had, I quote, in readiness a dozen or more cards ready prepared and grounds laid of several colors and complexions, which they would then select from whenever starting a new portrait, choosing that carnation closest to the sitter's complexion. The carnation thus provided a smooth surface to work on so that the skin of the sitter would itself appear smoother and impeccable at the expense of purely realistic imitation. Hilliard, in fact, draws attention to the many corrections to be made to an imperfect complexion, as when he recommends, for instance, to shadow all female sitters whose complexion would not be very fair, or should it be, I quote, too pale, too red or freckled, etc. In other words, Hilliard is here trying to promote his gentle art again. It's as the art of making all skins appear smooth, cleanly and white. And I here mean white in all senses of the word. Miniatures of sitters with dark skin were extremely rare at the time, even though technically possible, of course. One of the earliest miniature portrait of a black sitter, now known at least, is this portrait by Giovanna Garzoni, dated 1635, which has only been very recently identified, and I recommend. I don't have time to go into the detail of this beautiful picture, but I have added the link to an article on the website of the Philip Mould Gallery, which has lots of detail and well, tells a lot about the history of this picture. Not much has been written about this when looking at vellum in portrait miniatures, but the question of whiteness is central to the quality of the vellum and to the depiction of the carnation and the skin has appeared in discussions of ivory. I'm thinking, for example, of what Mary Creed at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York wrote in 2020 on the blog of the museum. I quote, "White Americans saw in ivory's creamy and semi-translucent surface a mirror on which to project their own likeness, especially the whiteness of their skin." Now, there might already be something about this racial construction and the overwhelming presence of white in most discussions of flesh in limning treatises. To go back to the priming of vellum, Hilliard's insistence upon its preparation and the laying of a carnation all point to the same obsession with cleanliness, smoothness, but also with the covering, the overlaying, to use Fudge's word again, of the animal skin underneath. Now, this was not a general or a systematic practice. Norgate notes, for example, that, I quote, "The Italians used no grounds at all, but worked a complexion upon the bare parchment without more ado, so that the representation of human skin could actually be made from the very animal skin without any painting over the vellum." This happens with some French miniatures as well, where the animal becomes the bare support of the naked skin, making the human face emerge from or in the vellum rather than over it. Representing the human flesh or living skin was the greatest aim of limners, at least of portrait miniaturists rather. For example, Hilliard writes in his treatise, I quote, "Now know that all painting imitateth nature or the life, but of all things the perfection is to imitate the face of mankind." So in this regard, again, Hilliard was further breaking away from the pictorial tradition of his medieval predecessors, whose illuminations on vellum commonly featured a great variety of subjects, including animals, of course. Even in miniatures, which would feature a portrait of the sitter in full and a background setting, the human figure always remains central in Hilliard's works. The very rare animals appearing in his miniatures are only ever used as symbols or signs. Here, probably a sign or a symbol of loyalty for this miniature of Hatton. This portrait miniature was probably intended for the Queen, and the dog would, well, probably here symbolized Hatton's devotion to his monarch. Now, the diminutive size of the dog also makes it clear that the human subject dominates the whole picture. The same happens with the second animal, which I could find in Hilliard's miniatures. To my knowledge, they are the only animals represented on the miniatures. I may be wrong, but I haven't found other animals depicted by Hilliard in his miniatures. So in this second miniature, you can see that the way in which the tame dog looks submissively at his master underlines the focus of attention in the picture, obviously. So the only life and illusion thereof admitted to the picture is that of the human subject represented. Any remnants of life in the animal's skin used was carefully removed through the various steps in the preparation of the vellum, so that the animal from which it was derived was nowhere to be seen or felt or smelt. I've already mentioned the idea of the overlaying of the carnation on top of the vellum card and the smoothness of the vellum, but it also has to be said that Hilliard insists very frequently in the art of limning on the need to work in a clean olfactive environment too. I quote, "A place where neither dust, smoke, noise nor stench may offend." And later on again in the treatise, "Sweet odors comfort the brain and open the understanding, augmenting the delight in limning." This could not be further away from the vellum making process, as was described, for example, in 1663 by the clergyman and writer John Beale before the Royal Society. One particularly smelly moment in parchment making is the initial soaking of the skin in lime or urine, but nearly all steps of parchment making until the final one are smelly and reminiscent of the limning animals to which those skins belonged. Killing the animal a second time, and for good as it were, when turning its skin into parchment is in fact really no easy task. Fats in particular are incredibly difficult to do away with. Skin resists. In an article entitled Histological Study of Sheepskin Transformation During the Recreation of Historical Parchment Manufacture, sorry, this is a long title, and it was published in 2020, scientists have shown how despite the thinness of the lambskin and the exhaustive treatment in lime, not all fats were saponified. And even in the final product, stained fat bodies were detectable on the hair side of the skin. Hence, perhaps the need to find a skin that never bore hair, to quote Hilliard again, so that follicles could not produce fat or grease, which is notoriously the most difficult thing to do away with. Grease and fat are also enemies to limning. Hilliard himself writes, I quote, "A color will not take by reason that some sweaty hand or fatty finger hath touched your parchments thereabout." Hilliard had an outstanding understanding of materials, which transpired through his treatise and which shows in other areas. For example, when he writes about the effect of sulfuric gases on pigments. But there still is, I believe, a lot to be made about the rhetorical and metaphorical echoes in his texts, as they do also shape his practice and perception of his own art. There's a kind of mirror effect between the immaculate parchment and the limner's own body. He should abstain from touching the picture with a fatty finger, and there should be no fat in the vellum. He should wear silk so as to shed no hair, much in the way vellum is supposed to have never borne hair. So the vellum's quality seems to reverberate on his very status. Everything has to be gentle, tame, odorless, and smooth. Hilliard's text makes it clear that the promotion of his gentle art called for the negation of the animal's life, or the very nature of this support, which his pencils or brushes overlaid in a way that was very close to his pen's work in his treatise. The repetitions that I've noted, the rhetorical transformation of skin into fabric, into textile, manages to present a cleanly and noble surface for his art, which he firmly wants to dissociate from that of the illuminators before him and around him, those working in other, far less gentle forms of limners. So to conclude very briefly, I'd like to quote Hannah Murphy in her online post on parchment for the blog of the Renaissance Skin Project. In this article, she describes precisely perhaps the very reason why Hilliard and others working along the same techniques would be so meticulous in the choice and treatment of vellum. So I quote, "The finished product reflects its former life as skin in a way that even a lay bystander can appreciate, while the craft of the maker is evident in the fineness of the texture, which varies from the dark, aged appearance of parchment made from animals that have died of natural causes, to the near translucent vellum, like a fingerprint. Every skin is unique. Once crafted, the parchment itself continues to bear the marks of the living skin. Veins, vessels, age, the health of the animal, marks of ill treatment, the vibrancy of a well-fed animal, even the marks of sun tanning remain visible on the surface. Looking at parchment, the maker told us, can tell you more about the written culture that produced it. It can tell you about animals, environment, diet, agriculture, and changing patterns in the economy. One key aspect in Hilliard's vision of his art and of his own status as a limner consisted precisely, I believe, in the overlaying of this memory of the skin, in the overlaying of one memory with another one living material, with a more powerful illusion of life, which was the required condition to elevate his subject, his art, and finally his own position. Thank you very much. Oh, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Anne-Valerie, for this fascinating paper. You are welcome to switch your cameras on if you want to. You don't have to, obviously.
I'll just turn the light on because I can't see much anymore.
Okay.
And if you have questions, you can raise your hand. And Rafael Costa, I can't see the rest of your name. And also you can ask your questions in French or in English.
We can't hear you, Rafael. Can you hear Rafael?
So maybe we take another question in the meantime.
Yeah, let's do that.
She needs to unmute. Tell her to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, well, I'll start with a question. I was fascinated by the similes or the references you made between obviously animal products and textile, but also the other animal product you brought in, which is ivory. Mm-hmm. How does ivory fit in? Because miniatures were also painted on ivory, or is that really rare? And how does that animal product fit in with the same? You know, obviously it's not skin, but
ivory came about, well, in portrait miniature painting, that is later in time. It's more of a succession. I mean, I think the first portrait miniatures in ivory were made around the year 1700, let's say, very beginning of the 18th century. So it's a sort of later innovation, and the first English portrait miniatures on ivory were made much later than those by Hilliard or Oliver. It first appeared in Italy. I'm not a specialist of this period or of ivory, but I do believe from what I've started to gather, because I've only just started working on ivory, and the reasons why it became a more successful choice of support for portrait miniatures is perhaps because it was even whiter, perhaps even more prestigious as well, because it was not, you know, your local calf that would have served the production of the portrait. So I think that there's perhaps something that contributes to making the miniature even more precious, a jewel. But I'm not very familiar with the treatment of ivory. I mean, I only know a bit about how it would have been how it would need to be prepared before you can actually paint on it. But it's just a later innovation mainly. But the reason why I focus on vellum is because I think that because miniatures were not yet called miniatures, it was also more of a stake for limners to make it clear why their art was to be distinguished from other forms of previous or contemporary limnings. So hence also, I guess, the need for a defense, the need for well, to persuade readers and people that portrait miniatures were a gentler art than other forms of limning. So I guess perhaps the stakes were different as well, because when ivory appears, then miniatures had a name, a prestige of their own as well. They had become a genre by then.
Thank you very much. Lynn?
And Valerie, thank you so much. Thank you for that. I'm very interested in the argument, and I think you've really shown that in order to prepare vellum for actual use in miniature painting, that it was, important to evacuate all, reference or all signs of animality, whether it be hair or stains or anything like that. But it seems, paradoxically enough or not, that Hilliard and some of the others emphasize that very animality in their treatises, in their theoretical writing about what they do to evacuate or erase it. They're talking abortive. They're talking about paths. They're talking about wounds. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if there might be a kind of distinction that they're making between theory and practice in terms of the evacuation of the animal. I don't know.
Mm. It's very interesting. I had never thought of it this way. To me there's something in the way, at least Hilliard, and others actually, in the way he uses the word abortive and abortive and the definition that he gives, which indicates that those were words which he did not expect the people who for who he was writing. This was a manuscript. It was never meant to be published, but it shows that people would not necessarily have immediately understood what it meant. So there's something sort of technical in the way that he presents the definition, at least, because he takes care to explain what it means. I don't know, in a way, this superstition, with the unborn calf has to do with, rarity, perhaps, to start with. This was not common. This was also a way of showing that this was an animal that had never been born, in a way. There had never been, any life of sorts. This is perhaps even more apparent in Théodore de Mayerne, the other manuscript, which I quoted at one point, in which Mayerne explains that this vellum comes from stillborn calves taken from dead cows. So a sort of, a doubly dead animals. That would be the cow and the calf. So there's something perhaps that sort of negates the life of the animal, you know, that does not sort of grant life to the animal that is used to. But I don't know, I'd have to think about it further, but I think it's a great idea. Thank you very much.
So Raphael, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yes, I'm very sorry. I forgot to turn the microphone on. Okay, so thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for your paper. Very interesting, and which, you know, insists on the purity of the material. In fact, I wanted to make sure I understood. You said in the beginning you were translating Hilliard's treatise into French, and if I did understand that, this is wonderful. It's something, it's great news. But did I get it right? Or
sorry, I can't hear you very well, Raphael. I'm sorry, Raphael. I can't hear you very well. Could you repeat this perhaps by moving closer to your microphone?
I was just saying that you said you were going to translate into French.
Yeah.
Hilliard's treatise.
Mm-hmm.
So I found this very exciting news, and I wanted to know whether you could say a bit more about that translation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I'm not translating it alone. I'm working on this translation with Céline Gachot, who's writing a PhD on French portrait miniature painters at the end of the 16th century in Paris mostly. She's at the University of Geneva. The reason why we're translating and working on a critical translation full with, you know, apparatus and footnotes, obviously, and is because of, in recent years, the links, the networks, the exchanges, the conversation, and the overall dialogue of artists across the channel has appeared as more and more central in the conception of portrait miniatures. So we do believe that by translating Hilliard's into French, we're also sort of building on this scholarship of the exchanges between Paris and London, not only, of course, but no, of course, Hilliard himself traveled to Paris, as you know, traveled to France, as you know, but there's something to be made about we believe about the exchange and the circulation of words as well, and it works with translation. I mean, portrait miniatures in Europe at the time are a very international sort of genre. The words and terminology circulates around with the objects because they're portable. So we thought that by translating the text would again contribute to this history of the circulation of words and techniques.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Raphael.
Anne-Marie?
Yes, thank you, and Valerie, for a wonderful paper. I had two questions that are very broad questions and perhaps things that you might want to think about in the longer term. And that was the first one relates to what Sherman was saying about hair and skin and their presence in the text. And I was wondering if you were taking any, if you were using any specific anthropological theories also in looking at this and seeing if you could relate it to other practices, other discourses in relationship to skin and animals and animal hair and the way. So is this something that surfaces in other places of the world too at the time, since you are interested in comparative approaches also to art history? And the second question had to do with the presence, the animal presence in the miniatures when you spoke about the dogs. I was wondering if there was any sort of bestiality or animality left in those animals at all, and if they do not become simple emblems or an object, sort of material object that speaks to social standing. So those were the two broad questions.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. About the first one, I'll have to look into other practices, and I'm still working on, you know, on those treatises produced in England and France mostly. I haven't had time to look at other practices or other places, but I do think there's definitely something to be made about wider comparisons and other practices, very much so. But it's not something that I've started doing yet. But I definitely intend to look into this in a near future. About the animal presence, yes, I very much agree. I mean, with the two miniatures that I've shown, and I mean, I've only shown those supposedly live animals in portrait miniatures. I've not dealt with the animals represented in jewels, say, for example, in other pictures by Hilliard. But I think they do more or less all have the same function. They all become sort of jewels, objects and things. I don't think there's any form of animality left. I very much agree with this, and I do think that it's partly related to Hilliard's wish to make it clear that his subject, the most perfect of all, again, is human life and human portraiture. It's also a way, I guess, of making it clear that he's no longer working along the lines of his medieval predecessors. Again, you know, that bestiaries are definitely not something that he'd be working on, I guess. But yeah, I do very much think that animality is nowhere to be seen in those dogs and other animals represented in the jewels, and that mostly objects or symbols. Yeah, very much agree with this.
Thank you. There's a question from Lily Freeman-Jones.
Hello, yes, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much for that fascinating talk, and Valerie, it was great and nice to finally meet you in a way as well. Yeah, no, I just had two thoughts. I was wondering whether you found any evidence. I know Hilliard's talking about the kind of ideal of limbing and really selling it as this high class luxe art, but I was curious whether there's any examples of people in a more aspirational way using cheaper parchment, like not vellum, for example, like rougher parchment, like making worse copies basically of these incredibly fine miniatures. I just wondered whether you'd come across that at all as a practice, whether it starts to seep down or if it remains very stratified.
I think it does. Again, I might be wrong, but I know that there are other forms of limbings on paper, of course, but I can't think of any sort of copies that would have been made on cheaper pieces of parchment. Or, but I'm again, it's as far as I know. I may be wrong here, but I can't think of any. The other cheaper forms of limbings would be yeah, on paper mostly, I'd say.
Yeah, I suppose at least the cheaper parchments that I've seen, it's often the whiteness that goes, so that might have been quite an issue in reproduction. So then paper might have been a better option if you could get white paper. Thanks. And then the other thing, I was really curious about this point that really struck, that these miniatures are guarded so much from touch, and you're talking about them being protected by these lockets and things. I've done a little bit of tiny bit of looking at parchment birthing girdles where they had these images of the cross or other kind of good luck venerated parts of the parchment which women would wear when they were giving birth, and then actually like there are some that have survived, and the cross or the favorite image on the parchment is actually worn away just from the frequency of the touch. And I know obviously vellum's a lot finer and more delicate, and especially with the paint, I suppose, would be like very vulnerable to touch. But we have these modern ideas of people kissing portraits of things. So I was just curious if you come across anything that mentions that or talks about kind of holding it, or
well, holding them very much so, but it's usually with the lockets around them again, like sort of protecting them. But I know that there are larger miniatures, some by Oliver even, which were made to be kept, whose format made that they were kept in drawers sometimes, and you could actually, you know, touch them. And the portrait miniatures, I can't think of a description of well, either in the documents in the archive that I've come across, or even in plays, because I use drama quite a lot as well to sort of gather and you know, more evidence about how those images were used. But I can't think of an example where they would actually be touched. The vellum itself, that is, and the not for portraits, at least. Again, I'm not talking about limbing in general, but for portrait miniatures, I can't think of any example where they would have been kissed or touched, or I don't think so. I can't think of any example, at least.
Yeah, well, I guess that kind of supports your point in a way, maybe, that because to us it's like, oh well, it's skin, so wouldn't they want to play on that kind of skin to skin contact? But yeah, it supports your point that even the animal skins completely disappeared and the human skins presented as this quite rarefied, stylized surface.
And yet there's something paradoxical, because there's something not sensorial, not sensual, but sensorial in the way miniatures are described sometimes in being worn, you know, next to the skin, but it has nothing to do with, you know, the contact of the animal skin. It's more the locket again. There is something, you know, that speaks of intimacy and something that you cherish in your hands and keep close to you, but it's never about it's never the portrait, the card and the portrait alone, I'd say.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, thank you so much.
There's a comment in the chat, I don't know whether you've seen it, and Marie, about whether kissing it and, you know, touching it would equate it with a religious object. Just to give the 18th century, there's way more touching and kissing, at least in representations of miniatures in the 18th century, but they're not on vellum at that point, as you stressed at the beginning. Maybe to tie up with Anne-Marie's question about other practices, I was curious about gloves, because we're talking about touching and the hands, but obviously at the time, people would wear gloves quite often, and they would have another type of skin close to their skin. So that might be something, you know, if you want to look at how specific this hair phobia was, maybe looking at gloves and how the treatment for gloves, what type of leather was being, you know, sought after, thought to be the best, the tanning process, the smoothness, that might be interesting, because at that point you can't avoid the touching, you know, it's meant to avoid touching with your hands, but it's touching your hands.
Yeah, immediately. Yeah, it's a great idea. Yeah.
And there was a question in the chat before about, I don't know whether the person still is here, Miriam, about Miriam, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, or I can ask it.
Yeah, hello, yes. I've just been thinking about, we're used to considering artists within sort of print, paper, precious metals, stones, you know, within networks dealing in that. But I mean, this sort of pushes it even further, where they're dealing with literally the meat trade, leather trade, you know, it seems to make them very much involved with a huge variety of trades at the time. And I was just wondering about how the vellum was marketed, and you know, did they have specific dealers, or was it simply a kind of byproduct, I suppose, of the leather and meat trade, and sort of how did the artists specifically acquire them and you know, have them made to their specifications? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. From what Peacham says in the 1612 treatise, which I briefly quoted earlier, you could get vellum from Paternoster's row in London, and that would be with the stationers. So this is where they would get their vellum from, but it's the only sort of evidence that I've found about the you know, the way that limners in particular could get their hands on vellum and vellum fit for limbing rather than parchment in general.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Pascal, go ahead. You're mute. There you go.
Sorry. Thank you very much for this really very interesting paper. I was just wondering about the rest of the media. I mean, when you look at medium specifications, when you look at, you know, what a miniature is made of, usually you're told that it's vellum on plain card. And I was wondering whether you knew anything about the process, and I find it, you know, with all the everything you've shown us about how precious the material is, I find it quite contradictory. Using it sounds as if, you know, the artist was using some ready-made material, and he thought. Do you have any further explanations about the process?
It's thank you very much for your question. It's detailed at great length in in many treatises at the time. The vellum is so thin that you need to apply it, to paste it on something a bit harder if you want to be able to, you need to starch it, then to burnish it, and to attach it to something like a playing card. Now there's recently a paper that has been published on playing cards in the issue of British Art Studies, and I think it's number 17, which I mentioned at the beginning. And they were just used to sort of straighten the material so that you could actually you know, paint on it. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked. In most cases, this would have been playing cards. Now it's interesting that Hilliard in his text only says mentions a pasteboard. He doesn't you know, go into as much detail as for vellum, where he explains, you know, very clearly the kind of parchment that he was using. So typically this was perhaps less important, even though again, according to some recent publications, there's been debates around this, but it's been argued that those playing cards might have been used for their specific symbolism as well, depending on, you know, the card that you were using. But again, it's been debated, but it was, I believe, mostly a practical need, because otherwise the vellum would have been impracticable, I'd say.
Thank you very much.
There's a question about the glue from Brigitte.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, there was animal glue as well in the as used as glue. It's mentioned in, not by Hilliard himself, at least not that I can remember, but in many other treatises at the time. Well, if you look into the detail of animal-made objects, they're everywhere, from the tooth that would be used for the burnisher, from the brushes with the squirrel's hair, to the feather, the white feather that would be used, and you know, they're everywhere, animal-made objects in miniature painting. But interestingly enough, even when describing those objects, Hilliard insists on their, again, their cleanliness. Most of them are white, they're polished, they're very, well, very un-animal-like, you know, they're all very tame objects.
Yes, and if I can add a little something, even nowadays brushes, I mean, good brushes for painters are animal made, because you seek the best hair and that is not the synthetic one. It has to come from animal.
Thank you very much, Lily, for the answer to the about the skin industry in the chat.
Is there a final question for Anne-Valerie? Well, if not,
thank you.
Let me thank Anne-Valerie for a fantastic paper tonight.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
And the really interesting discussions we had after. So thank you for your questions and your answers, Anne-Valerie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just an announcement about the next session, which will be taking place in a month exactly, on the 14th of March. A very different topic. We're still pursuing the relationship between material culture and visual culture, but we'll be moving to 20th century photography, so slightly different. We'll be welcoming Eliane de l'Armina. I need to come up with the right page with not to, oh yeah, there you go, I've got the title. She'll be giving a paper called Garden Projections, Sensorial Activations Between Project Grounds and Projected Slides in Early Chicago Public Housing. So she's looking at photography and public housing policies in Chicago at the beginning of the 20th century. So thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Ariane, and thank you, Anne-Valerie.
Thank you.
That
Thanks
was
everyone
fantastic.
for coming up.